The Exodus didn't happen. According to Exodus chapter 12 verse 37, sometime during the second millennium BCE, about 600,000 men on foot, plus women and children, left Egypt in a mass exodus. If we include the same number of women and, I don't know, maybe half as many children, that would come to around 1.5 million people, who would then proceed to wander the desert for 40 years on their way to the promised land of Canaan. Oh, and apparently they were joined by a mixed multitude of non-Israelites too, so we're probably looking at more than 2 million people. Now, there's some dispute about when this event was supposed to have occurred, though the two main options are the 15th and 13th centuries BCE. Now, according to the Encyclopaedia Britannica online, the population of Egypt at this time during the New Kingdom is estimated to have been between 2 and 3 million people. So basically, according to the book of Exodus, roughly the equivalent of the entire population of Egypt left the country at that time. Even assuming that these people were slaves and were not counted among the population, can you imagine the economic and political impact of such an event on Egypt? There is, however, not the slightest evidence in the Egyptian records of the time of any such event having occurred. Business went on as usual in Egypt. The total population of Israel at the height of Solomon's power is estimated to have been between 800,000 and 1 million people. And this would have included a much larger area than modern-day Israel, including parts of modern-day Syria and Lebanon. Now, these figures are very approximate, but they're probably less than the entire number of people who left Egypt, supposedly, 200 to 400 years earlier. And they included many people who were already in the land of Canaan, people who weren't from the tribes of Israel. Now let's take a look at the events following the arrival of the people in Canaan under the leadership of Joshua. We read in the book of Joshua that the people of Israel brought down the walls of Jericho and sacked the city. However, archaeological evidence indicates that Jericho was not a walled city at this time. Even based on the earlier date of the Exodus itself, the walls had already fallen prior to the Israelites' arrival. Next, we're told that Joshua took the city of Ai. However, all of the archaeological evidence indicates that Ai fell more than 1,000 years earlier. In fact, there's very little historical evidence outside the book of Joshua itself to support any of the events described there. If there was a movement of a new group of people into the area, later to become the Israelites, this was probably a mixture of migration, assimilation, with a few localized conflicts, rather than some kind of unified military campaign such as that described in the book of Joshua. So there's little to no evidence supporting the idea that a massive number of people, exceeding 2 million, left Egypt all at the one time and entered the land of Canaan some 40 years later. Such a massive movement of people would certainly have been recorded by Egypt. In fact, it would have probably had a devastating impact on the Egyptian economy. This mass of people moving through the desert would have left abundant evidence of their presence and activity, of which we have precisely none. And their invasion of the land of Canaan would have left a large historical record. There is no such record. It didn't happen. What I find interesting, though, about the whole Exodus narrative is that it probably reflects quite a long history of interaction between Semitic peoples and the Kingdom of Egypt. For example, consider the story of Abraham and Sarah. Genesis reports that Abraham, then Abram, came from the city of Ur, which is in modern-day Iraq. I would suggest that this probably represents an earlier migration of Semitic people from the east in around 2000 BCE into the land of Canaan. These were probably a nomadic or semi-nomadic tribe in search of better land. This land was then promised to Abraham. Interestingly, we read in Genesis 12, verse 10, that Abraham travelled to Egypt during a time of famine. It wasn't uncommon for people to drift towards the Nile Valley in hard times because of the more reliable supply of food there. So there's a possible echo here of some early interaction between Egypt and Semitic people. Then there's a story of the Hyksos period of Egyptian history. Between 1650 and 1550 BCE, the Hyksos were kings of the 15th dynasty of Egypt. These were the Hekau-Khasut, rulers of foreign lands. Forgive my Egyptian pronunciation. They ruled part, though not all, of Egypt. Now, based on their language, the Hyksos were a Semitic people, probably originating somewhere in the land of Canaan. When Ahmose I, the first king of the 18th dynasty, took the throne, the Hyksos were finally fully driven out of Egypt sometime between 1570 and 1554 BCE. Because of the dates, only a short time before the earliest date reckoned for the Exodus, some have argued that these were, in fact, the Jews. Josephus makes this claim and identifies the expulsion of the Hyksos from Egypt with the Exodus. Now, this hardly accords with the biblical description of the Hebrew people as an enslaved people who were delivered from slavery by God. The Hyksos were not slaves, they were conquerors. And perhaps this idea appealed more to Josephus. It probably pleased him to think that the Hebrew people had once actually been rulers of, at least part, of Egypt. Regardless of this, the Hyksos period does reinforce this connection between Semitic people and Egypt. The Exodus perhaps reflects this cultural memory that Egypt has played some part in the emergence of the Hebrew people. We can go back even further in history. During Egypt's Middle Kingdom, between about 2055 to 1650 BCE, Egypt had some military outposts in southern Canaan. During the New Kingdom, around 1550 to 1070 BCE, Egypt had a much stronger presence in Canaan. Thutmose III, 1479 to 1425 BCE, secured Egyptian dominance over much of Canaan and established a system of vassal city-states paying tribute to Egypt. Egypt maintained this control until around 1200 BCE. So if indeed the Israelites did leave Egypt in a mass exodus, they did it to end up in Egypt. This is actually why I find the Bible so interesting, because although it's often not at all accurate from an historical point of view, stories like that of the Exodus and indeed of Abraham seem to contain echoes of events in Israel's past. Deep in the past, perhaps as far back as Abraham, the fate of the Hebrew people was intertwined with Egypt. It is, of course, a far cry from this to the elaborate stories of the Exodus and the outlandish claims that those stories are designed to buttress, namely that God gave the land of Canaan to the people of Israel, that he delivered them miraculously from slavery in Egypt and led them in conquest over the other peoples who already lived in the land of Canaan. None of this happened, neither the Exodus nor the conquest. These stories are created later to justify Israel's claim over the land.